Hello, everybody, and welcome to Stroke Warrior Radio again with one of our, I'm going to just call it a therapist interview, but our guest today is actually one of the first people that supported me in this whole thing and one of my very first interviews. So hopefully I'm going to do a better job this time than I did last. But um, you guys have probably know her, Abbe Simon from iCommunicare. Hi, Abby, how are you?
Hi, Ralph. There's no pressure to do better than the first time, since the first time was also great.
Yeah, I thought so too. I mean,
Just a little technology glitch here and there, but everybody expects that.
yeah, but I think we did a good job and people have responded well to the show when I've repeated it.
Good.
So, well, the services you do now at iCommunicare is speech language pathology, but you've gone the extra step by incorporating yoga into your practice. What led you to integrate yoga into your practice, particularly for stroke recovery?
Yes, as you said, my original connection with you was because of my long-standing career as a speech language pathologist that has focused and continues to focus on working with adults who have acquired communication disorders, typically resulting from a stroke. And when I work with people who have strokes and have communication issues, they are likely facing something called aphasia or a motor speech impairment that affects their ability to produce sounds and words and sentences. And I continue to do that for sure, and enhanced my practice by initially becoming a health and wellness or integrative health coach so
Oh,
that I could provide further support for people after stroke and be somewhat of an accountability coach that allows someone who is either discharged from a hospital or needing to see doctors with more regularity but don't have the ability to do so. I provide health coaching for the person who's had a stroke as well as their care partners so that people can realize that stroke doesn't just affect the person who has it, that life after stroke doesn't have to suck, and that life after stroke doesn't mean that you have to give up everything you were doing before. And so, with that health coaching mindset, we look at things in somebody's life that goes beyond just the symptoms of having had a stroke, whether it's being creative, whether it's maintaining relationships or learning or finances or home cooking and values. There's so many things that contribute to health other than taking blood pressure medication. And to answer your question, which I'm avoiding, I guess, which is why I brought yoga into this as a long-standing yoga practitioner. Last year, I decided to become certified as a yoga instructor
okay.
and yoga instructor. So now I sound like a real New Yorker,
There you go.
bringing it out amongst ourselves. So I knew that when I was becoming a yoga instructor that I wanted to deepen my own practice and learn more about it. Specifically, how could I help people post stroke do yoga? And after that training and some months that followed, I created something called Stroga, which sounds perhaps like an Italian dish, but it is the combination of yoga and some letters from stroke to marry the two and allow people who have been impacted by a stroke, whether, like I said, it's the person directly or their care partners, to incorporate some of the yoga principles. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because I think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that when people hear yoga, they automatically associate it with some type of spiritual or chanting or slow movement like exercise that could be very boring. And I understand that. And people say, oh, you do yoga,
Yeah.
and they give you this little like prayer symbol or peace sign. But I have learned that it's way beyond that and see the benefits of people after stroke incorporating it.
Well, speaking of benefits, based on the experience when starting this, what what specifically does yoga do for stroke survivors in terms of, I guess, combining it with your speech, communication, mobility, and overall well-being.
So if we remove stroke from it for a second, because I feel important. It's important to say that when someone's had a stroke, they don't only identify themselves as a person that's had a stroke or a stroke survivor. And that yoga doesn't necessarily have to be associated with people who have not had a stroke. So if we look at it and say, well, what are the benefits of yoga in general? We know that yoga has so much beneficial effect on someone's brain health, their sleep, their stress, their mood, their bodily awareness, their breathing, their flexibility, strength. There are lots of, spinal adjusting, and that would be in general. So then if we say, well, how can yoga affect someone after a stroke? And we'll think of the person whom the stroke has happened to directly. And we'll talk about what happens when physical limitations ensue as
Yeah,
well. But if someone has had a stroke, they may have had reasons for that stroke. And you and I were joking before we hit record that we all face stress. And stress is something that, with or without stroke, can disrupt somebody's ease and their life. And yoga can really and truly reduce stress and help somebody become more aware of their thoughts. And that doesn't mean that the person has to be sitting and saying,
yeah.
oh, and
No Hare
so,
Krishnas, right?
right. And so if we know that yoga can improve breath, which means more oxygen to the brain, the more release of carbon dioxide, mind and muscle connection, and body awareness and thought control, those are ways to reduce stress, which of course could only enhance and improve somebody's medicinal way of doing that as well. So if you are a care partner of somebody who's had a stroke, perhaps their lives or your life is also, affected by or involve some stress because your role as a care partner has changed, and maybe you don't have time to train or exercise as you once were. And so what I've seen is that yoga could be adapted to be very, very simple and restorative and still, or very intense, powerful, and invigorating. So the beauty of yoga is that it could be very personalized to meet somebody's physical and mental needs.
Wow. And that's part of the reason I'm so excited about doing this, because I have always thought of yoga like you said. Now it's like I'm probably at the point where I should look at something else to help
And
in
you
my
know what,
routine.
Ralph? But sometimes, especially men, they hear the word yoga and they immediately turn their head because number one, they think they can't touch their toes, they're not flexible, and it's too sort of woo-woo, and you won't
Yeah,
get big muscles from doing yoga, so why would somebody do it? And frankly, when I was studying to become a yoga teacher, my intention was to do a certain pose better and longer and become more capable of harder and challenging things. But as my teachers know, I learned that yoga is so much more than what we called asana or movement. And when you're ready, we can talk about there are 8 parts of yoga. And that's when I realized that someone doing yoga doesn't only have to do a headstand or a split or a one-legged balance. That is so not necessary to be doing yoga.
right, right. And is there current research findings that support the use of yoga in stroke rehab, or how do you stay informed about that if it's not that huge a research area?
No, there's actually a lot of people who even might be listening to this who have either YouTubed or looked into either adaptive yoga or chair yoga. And there are other people, plenty of people, I mean, a nice handful of people who offer yoga classes in an adaptive way for people that have had stroke. So while we're not doing a live video here to do a yoga class, we're simply talking about the benefits of and how someone can
Right.
even begin to start and consider doing yoga after stroke. But in terms of research, I haven't looked at any statistical findings, but I see people who are offering yoga for people who've had stroke. And what I see is that, and what I offer is that even when somebody has a spastic or immobile limb, right? Because if you have certain types of strokes and one of your arms and or legs becomes immobile or very rigid, you're not able to do certain yoga poses. There are ways that a yoga instructor and someone mindful of the neurological, you know, body system, how to adapt that for someone that's had a stroke. So I think anyone that does yoga, even if it's just being still, controlling what we call pranayama or breath, that even if it's 3 to 5 minutes, is only beneficial to somebody's overall health.
Okay, that brings me to, um, I guess, tailoring the yoga practices for a new client. I mean, how
Mhm.
can yoga be adapted for someone with limited mobility or hemiparesis?
Mhm. So I'm going to answer that question and say first that I alluded before to yoga being 8 things. So again,
Okay,
even before my training, I thought, and maybe most people think, that yoga is getting on a mat and moving your body like a contortionist and doing these interesting poses.
okay,
Totally makes sense. However, in addition to those movements, yoga, which is, thousands of years old, is more than that. And it includes a way of becoming in touch with ourselves. And that sounds woo woo, like, oh, do you want to be introspective and come inward? Yeah, that's one aspect of yoga where we increase our concentration and our focus. But parts of yoga also include being disciplined, observing our personal habits and interests, and using breath. Like I said, this word pranayama, our breath is a life force. And so when people after a stroke are working towards becoming healthier to live a better life, we take for granted that we are all breathing automatically. But if yoga is just a controlled breath exercise, you could say you've done yoga because you have focused on some type of particular breathing exercise, which is taught in a yoga class that can then be implemented with someone's own guidance. You don't need a yoga instructor once you've been taught how to do some breathing. And another aspect of yoga is um, practice being ethical and practices that we could do in life to restrain ourselves from maybe indulging or being dishonest. So in addition to the body doing certain things to say you're a yogi, there are also acts that one can do to practice the principles of yoga. And I know that sounds, again, a little bit, hunky wonky, but
yeah.
it shows that whether you're whatever religious belief or spiritual belief you have, it's not necessary, because as a human being who's gone through a tragedy or some kind type of trauma, I think anyone that wants to think about how we treat ourselves, how we think, and how ethical we are could be something that we feel is a positive health decision or a healthy decision. And the greatest part of yoga, people say, is to become so inward and meditative that you realize that you can control your thoughts. So when someone has had a stroke and their thoughts become worrisome or negative or overwhelming and either guilty if they're not the person that's had the stroke, or anxious and nervous and depressed, all those are thoughts. And when we learn to meditate, even by someone else guiding us or not, we realize how controlled our thoughts can be. And again, without doing a headstand, if you just learn to observe your thoughts and control them, you are making a healthy, conscious decision. So people can have negative thoughts. We should have negative thoughts. But when we practice slowing down the mind and noticing our thoughts and concentrating, that's also an act of yoga. So I just feel it helps people to understand that when you say you're doing yoga, it doesn't have to be these extraordinarily flexible and challenging poses.
Right, right.
So when somebody's had a stroke, if they have some limb involvement, obviously standing might be a challenge. And in a lot of yoga poses, it requires us to be standing. So when someone wants to do the physical practice of yoga, the asana, the movement, the person teaching them would have to take very, very close consideration or pay close attention to that individual's physical limitations. Clearly, someone from a medical standpoint should clear somebody that's had a stroke in terms of whether they're hypertensive, whether they're hypotensive. Does somebody become short of breath with exertion? Does someone become dizzy, or does someone feel unsafe if they're standing? All those things require modifications. People can get lightheaded if your head is below your heart. So those are things that a yoga teacher should know before offering different types of movement to someone that's had a stroke. And the use of props, whether it's a chair, whether it's a table, whether it's a wheelchair, whether it's your own limb. So a lot of times when I'm working with someone, whether I'm doing speech therapy or yoga, I will say to an individual that has a weakened right arm, take your left hand, your strong hand, and grab your right wrist. And I'm sure, you know, a lot of people and people listening to this will know that if you don't use it, you lose it. So we have to wake up and let that limb know, even if it's not moving a lot, that it can take some passive movements. So taking that left hand to the right wrist, even if you're just, as I'm showing you here, just bring it up to chest or belly button height, we're letting the brain focus on the opposite side of the body and just get a little bit of passive range of motion on that side, and then do it equally, but obviously with greater movement on the healthier, stronger side. And the same thing can happen with our legs, whether you're, you know, just doing some toe taps from a chair or taking the stronger leg behind the weaker leg and using your strong foot to sort of move as a lever the weaker calf. That's another way to just invigorate that weaker side and let the brain be reminded that that limb is there. And if someone's using a cane or a walker or a wheelchair that's in a locked position and needs some support standing, you could implement some standing, even just spinal rotation, shoulder rotations, hip movement while standing without having to stand on just one foot. So there really are endless ways to modify physical movements, but I think that if someone has limb involvement and weakness, yoga, or the idea of yoga, will, you know, it could be discouraging, the thought of, because they think they can't do it due to their physical compromise. But that's not true.
Right. Well, and neuroplasticity kicks in. So, I mean, the body relearns or the brain relearns the movements,
It
correct?
does, but when you're right, but if there is a paralysis, if we, you know, if there's really very limited movement, then we have to say, okay, well, that can't really move as well as it did. But what else can we do? How can we compensate for that lack of movement? And even if someone's sitting and they're not able to move their arms, think about sitting in our chair right now, you and I, and just drawing your navel towards your spine and sort of flexing your pelvis. You can even just get a little bit of a contraction rather, and your spine, your lower back, and then by drawing your navel away from your spine, you're just doing some hip movement and spinal curvature movements that are also just getting some passive movement in a way that if you're just sitting in a chair or on a couch all day, you're still and static. You can still get little small movements just by tilting and flexing the pelvis and or the spine and the neck.
Wow. So it's a whole mind-body connection, right? I mean,
Mind, body, and mind muscle connection. That's such a big thing and thing I say in my yoga classes, that the connection of our mind to our muscles, because if you are holding a yoga pose that's challenging and you feel the muscle fatiguing, like any exercise someone does, it's mind over matter, and the mind and the muscle connection is really fierce. So if we tell ourselves that the muscle has to stop working, it will. But if we tell ourselves that we can do it for just a second longer or 3 seconds longer, it will as well.
okay. Okay. Are there specific styles of yoga and practices better suited for stroke survivors?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So I mentioned earlier that yoga can be restorative or it could be invigorating. So if we think about the most passive form of yoga, it's something called yin, Y-I-N. And yin yoga is something that is pretty much done sitting down or lying down. And it requires a person to hold one stretch or one small movement for maybe 3 to 4, even 5 minutes. And that is something you could do using, like I said earlier, one of your stronger limbs. So if I took my weak arm and cradled it with my stronger arm and just allowed that weaker arm to sit here in this hold, that's getting a really nice long stretch in the shoulder. And even asking the weaker arm, the stronger arm to hold up a little extra weight. So if your left arm was immobile, but you took your right arm and carried it across, right? Your both arms are involved and activated in some way. You could hold that pose. It would be tricky. You'd hold that pose for a long time. Then you could also just sort of tilt your ear towards that shoulder. So there's a way to use some compound movements also. So this is a yin movement and sort of a deepening stretch or restorative way to access the muscles and the tendons. And the complete and utter opposite of a yin restorative practice is a power or a vinyasa class or something called ashtanga, which really requires people to focus a lot on alignment and very specific bodily awareness. And it would probably be harder for someone that has some physical limitations.
But it's not impossible for them to start with it. I mean,
Not so if a person doesn't have, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, what factors should a stroke survivor consider before and starting a yoga practice?
Number one, they'd have to make sure that their blood pressure and their cardiac health and all those things were being medically stable. And to consider what they should consider what they want out of it. There are plenty of people like yourself who after a stroke could do a power vinyasa class technically if you wanted to, or not just a restorative yin class. That would take some working up toward and the use of props like some pillows or some blocks or some straps. So starting, maybe someone did yoga before their stroke and now they have to learn to do it differently because they do have some weakness or because their blood pressure does drop if their head goes below their heart. So I think the way to start, if never having done yoga before, would be to do something very basic and with someone that knows that you have had a stroke, because even if you're not showing signs, right? Because sometimes a stroke survivor it's invisible, right? Not
Yeah.
everybody that's had a stroke looks like they've had a stroke. So I think you could never go into a yoga class without letting the teacher know that you have had a history of a brain change.
One of the things that shocked me, it took me close to 7 years before I realized the emotional and psychological benefits of succeeding and the little victories every day. In what ways does yoga contribute to that emotional and psychological well-being of an individual recovering?
And well, because of what we said earlier about yoga not only just being the physical part, so there's one of these limbs of yoga is called yama and niyama. And I used the English words earlier to mention that these are ways that people conduct themselves in life and the behaviors that they choose. And I think when we learn to become aware of decisions and that our thoughts can be controlled, and that by slowing down and becoming aware of our thoughts and our breath, it can easily reduce our stress, improve our emotional well-being. It can improve our strength, both mentally and physically. It can improve our blood circulation. So if we are still, or certain poses that you do in yoga increase blood flow to the brain and to extremities. And so that in and of itself seems to be a very logical reason why someone after a stroke might want to incorporate some yoga into their life. And sometimes after a stroke, if you have a really tense, tight, rigid limb or hand, pain can be relieved by doing some long stretching and increase some tension, even in your posture that might be compromised after a stroke if someone's been sitting for a long time. And again, I'm not suggesting that this is so easy for people to do, especially by themselves, because of the potential limb involvement and balance issues. But if someone has the support of an aide or care partner, someone that could help them out, there's something called partner yoga. And so two people could do yoga together by supporting one another.
Wow, never heard of that one.
And the other thing I just want to say about yoga is that when we have a mind muscle connection, that helps our cognitive skills. So mindful movement and breathing improve someone's focus and their memory and attention. And that in and of itself, you mentioned the word neuroplasticity, helps the brain, adapt and reorganize itself just by asking the brain to become aware of something. And I think when those things happen, your mood and your emotional resilience can really prove itself to be much more positive than one might think. And it could give such a, if someone after a stroke feels like they're losing their ability to accomplish things, and let me turn the light on in here. I think by doing these little small steps without having to do a big grand yoga pose, that feeling of self-empowerment can be achieved because you can show yourself that you can learn something new.
Yeah. How can you and the patient determine if they're physically and mentally ready to begin yoga after a stroke?
I think if anybody can move part of their body, absolutely, they could do yoga. But having said that, and as I said that, I realize that that doesn't make sense because it goes back to yoga could just be breath work, and
Okay.
yoga could just be mind work and mindfulness. So yes, would it be wonderful if someone can move their limbs and engage in the postures, poses, and asymmetry and symmetrical movements in the yoga practice? Yes, because that does wonders for the brain, the bilateral use of the brain. I think just in terms of the physical readiness has to be a certain medical clearance, a physical comfort level that someone has, because with any exercise, there is risk involved, probably not a ton with yoga, but there have been yoga injuries. One of the reasons I became a teacher was because as a student, I'd often see yoga students in class in such distorted poses that I knew it was like an injury waiting to happen. So if you've had a stroke and have some, again, that word like compromised physical range of motion or mobility, and you're not aligning your spine right, or something is overused and overextended, compensation can cause other injuries to happen. So someone
Okay.
has to be wise when working with an individual who's had a stroke, if they do indeed, or more so when they have some type of physical impairment.
Something we haven't talked about before about this is it's and finding a yoga instructor for stroke recovery in particular. Is there what should that be looking for in that person? Should that person be able to do an assessment and then come up with a plan, or is it a
I think if
checklist?
you have a private yoga teacher, that would be much more sort of expected. That what you just described in terms of an assessment seems to be something that maybe a physical therapist who knows the kinematics, who knows body neurology and rehabilitative factors that need to be considered when anyone is going to begin a new exercise. But I think a really skilled yoga instructor should do a good enough history if you're doing a one-on-one or small group. When anyone goes into a yoga studio and maybe fills out a new form, they're not going to get too specific on your medical history, but it would be a person's own need to self-advocate and go into a class if it is big and let the instructor know where they're coming from. And hopefully the teacher would be astute enough to take that into consideration and say to someone, this class is not appropriate for you, given the history that you've provided. So I think that would have to be a very transparent piece of information.
It have to be a conversation between the two.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And the
absolutely.
thing I just, as I was saying, the thing about the group class, sometimes people after a stroke could feel isolated or their lives have changed so much, they may not be able to resume activities. But now I just had this feeling of when there's small group training or small group yoga classes, participating in those small classes could, as you know, someone that attends and provides support groups for people, that sense of community and reducing the feeling of isolation might be another opportunity for people after stroke to meet others if there is a group for people to do yoga after stroke, which there probably are. As we discussed, there's lots of videos online
Yeah.
that yoga teachers offer, either chair yoga or some type of restorative option. But I hope
Well,
that our conversation is really so that if people are ever considering yoga after stroke, either as the person themselves whose brain had the stroke or someone in that person's life, that they can hear us talking and say yoga doesn't just have to be in a Buddhist temple in utter silence, but rather it could be with music, it could be with silence or music, it could be a combination, it could be just thinking. So it's not just the craziness that people automatically associate it to be.
you mentioned a lot of things online. Should the patient or the survivor or warrior, whatever you want to call, um, are there any, what is it, conditions that they are that they should not be involved in yoga or
I mean,
symptoms?
reasons why someone shouldn't do yoga?
Yes.
I would think that if someone had, again, I keep coming back to the first thing I think of, and I'm not a doctor, is blood pressure. I'm also thinking of any kind of circulatory issue or easy bruising, or maybe certain medications that cause a lot of blood thinning if you're going to bruise. Well, I say that, but one might not think you're going to really get bruised in yoga. But I think most specifically would be to have good blood pressure. Sometimes people wear heart monitors, right? Or these, smart watches can monitor someone's heart rate if people are trying to stay within a certain target zone. Any kind of exercise can elevate or depress your heart rate. So that's something that probably needs to be considered. And then I think just like anything, we want to be able to connect with and resonate with a person that we're trusting to improve us. So if
Yeah.
someone was coming to me and said, "Oh, I heard you offer yoga for people that have had a stroke," the first thing I would say was, "Well, we should meet first and see if we have, feel like we could work together and see what the rapport is like." But it also couldn't hurt if someone was curious and taking a class or working with someone to go once. And if you don't like it, you don't go back again.
Is it safer to do that than jump right into an online class? I mean,
I think the beauty of the online class is that you can fast forward, rewind, you can pause it, you could go to another class. There are these classes available on YouTube that, I mean, I don't offer them there, but people do. And so if somebody listening is interested, let me see how someone might offer adaptive yoga for someone that's had a stroke. That is certainly Googleable or YouTubeable, and they could try it in their own home.
what a
And
great term. I've never heard of that term, an adaptable stroke for, I
for
mean, that's
adaptive yoga
adaptive
is what
yoga.
I would call the type of yoga one needs to do when and if they have any stroke related physical issue that compromises their ability to move the way they might have pre-stroke. So how can we adapt a pose? And frankly, even when I'm doing yoga, I have to make adaptations or modifications because I might not be able to do something, or maybe I want to modify something and make it more challenging. The beauty of yoga is that it is very modifiable. So even if there's a group of people doing poses together, not everybody has to move their body the way the person next to them is moving it. And just think, if we are in a yoga class and we know that most yoga classes end in something called shavasana, which is a pose in and of itself called corpse pose. That pose is when you reach the utter state of succumbing to gravity and allowing your body to just completely and utterly relax. And if you achieve that state of relaxation where it feels like you're just sleeping but being conscious of it, that's the highest power of someone having done yoga, is to allow the body after the work to really feel the utter opposite and be aware how their body can relax.
Wonderful. Any any precautions or guidelines they should take? I mean, should they kind of, are there common mistakes or misconceptions that patients might have, or specific poses or movements, or is that all individual? Again, meeting with this instructor.
Probably that, but again, I'm thinking of someone, it depends on where they are in their stroke recovery process, but there are lots of yoga people or yogis that do work on their heads, or they do inversions. And so perhaps someone that's had a brain injury or any kind of carotid artery or some dissections in the neck, or, I don't think standing on their head and doing those types of inversions, or maybe putting a lot of pressure on their neck, their cervical spine. But again, I'm not an orthopedist. I think
Right.
I would have to see the person in front of me and really get a sense of what their body can do and really what someone wants out of it. Someone might say, I just want to know how I can stretch my weaker leg and maybe use another chair to hold it up. It's again, finding ways to move the body in a creative way that maybe someone else wasn't aware of until someone looked at them individually.
You've mentioned chair a couple times, and I've heard this term before about yoga, about what's called
Chair yoga.
chair yoga. There you go. Yeah, is that a good
It's
way to
it's very
start for?
trendy. It's very trendy, Ralph.
Oh,
And it's
okay.
trendy. It's not only trendy just in senior citizen places, it's trendy at the beach. I've seen people do it where literally you just take a chair, and if you have trouble standing up, you can just swivel around in a wheelchair or a regular chair and allow your feet to stay on the floor. Sometimes people put one chair in front of another chair to support the leg that might not be able to stay up. Some people might stand up and use the back of a chair as support. But really, chair yoga is a way to reduce the need to have to stand and move your body, fold over, or back bend. It's just using the torso and legs in a much more stable position, not likely to increase the heart rate as much as some standing poses would, especially moving from one to the other. So that's a very, very acceptable and appropriate adaptation for people who have limitations.
And it's probably a safer way for some people to start.
Totally. It might not
Yeah,
feel like they're exercising or really doing something, but even if you and I just did this and we moved one toe back and forth, we'd feel it in our shin, we'd feel it in our quad. We could just hold it and get some strength, or we can do some stretching for flexibility without ever getting up off of our chair.
it's amazing. I'm
Yep.
gonna have to
Maybe you'll
try
try
this.
it one day.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to. I'm gonna really have to. Um, should stroke should you try, and again, it goes back to self-advocacy, I guess. I should probably speak to my physical therapist about it first.
I would first, like from a neurological or medical standpoint, make sure that you are medically stable and cleared to do any kind of exercise. Clearly, yoga being one of the more gentle ones, but that would be the first mode of, way to get cleared.
Okay.
A physical therapist for sure could work in conjunction with a yoga instructor and sort of, share and collaborate information.
I hope I say this right, but what advice or motivation would you give to a stroke survivor that are hesitant to try yoga?
That yoga isn't hokey. Yoga has more benefit than people might think, because like we started and said, that there are sleep benefits, there are stress benefits, there are emotional benefits, there are bodily benefits. There's just so many benefits to it. And as someone who has tons of energy and doesn't understand the concept of being still, I will say that once I learned how to do it, I feel like my day isn't complete without a little bit of it. And that when you notice stillness and your mind and even the power of your breath, it really changes the nervous system in a conscious and unconscious way. And that after a stroke, when your nervous system has become dysregulated, who wouldn't want to regulate it more? And even if you do a breathing exercise 3 times a week, you are making an improvement in your health. So how can you refute that pitch?
Yeah. Are there any outward signs that indicate a stroke survivor is making progress?
Increased flexibility, increased thoughts, increased mood, increased improved sleep, reduced stress. Maybe they just feel better about themselves knowing that they've done something new. I mean, maybe they've never done yoga. Now someone's had a stroke and they can't weightlift, they can't bike, they can't do things that they used to do. So they feel like, oh, now I can't exercise anymore. Just want to let my body just sit here. Well, that's not necessarily true. If you're willing to change, if you're willing to have a challenge, certainly dive in and try.
Okay. How often, I realize it's probably a gradual thing, but how often should stroke patients practice and their families practice yoga to see improvement?
Like everything we do, the more we do it, the more improvement we see. But for someone that's never done yoga before, try 15 minutes once a week, then try 30 minutes. Just take slow. Maybe if someone will do it and they'll say, I'm never doing this again. But at least they've tried. Maybe someone will do it and they'll say, oh my God, I'm going to do this again tomorrow. I think the more you do it, the more you will achieve, because we know that repetition increases neuroplasticity, but anyone that's doing anything exercise wise gets better the more they do it, the more they practice it, as long as they're practicing it safely and correctly. But I don't know in terms of, oh, what's the recommended frequency? I think
Yeah,
it's
it just depends on the person, I
individual.
guess.
Sounds kind of like vague, but I think it
Yeah.
is.
No, I that probably would work for me, for example. To
Yeah.
start out with maybe once or twice a week for 15 minutes,
Yeah.
to try something else just to help
And
with it.
one of the things people could try is, even if you can stand up, if you can stand on your 2 feet with your hands alongside your body and close your eyes, that's balance. That's a balance pose, because when we're standing, we're usually looking at something, we're focused on something to keep us still and even. But in yoga, you could close your eyes and just feel yourself in space, or you could keep your eyes open and just look at something called like a drishti or a focal point, and just concentrate on one thing. Don't even ask your body to do some kind of funky movement, but even by coming aware of yourself in space, that just think is controlling your thoughts. And so when people have had a stroke and their brain function has been altered, we want to prove that we can control certain things. And so when we can even just control our movement, being our to be still, or the movement of our inhalations and exhalations, that's using our brain to have self-control. Because when we breathe, it's this autonomic system that is allowing us to be alive. But when I stop and say, okay, I'm going to breathe in for 4, that takes so much more. And what if I want to hold my breath? All those things take so much more mindfulness and control. And when I'm doing that, I'm sort of forgetting about all those little extra thoughts that might pop into my head about what I'm worried about, what I can't do, or what I've just done before. So that's health right there.
Yeah, a light bulb just went off for me. That's the 4-7-8 breathing exercise I do.
Yep.
It just takes me away from everything.
That's pranayama. That's yoga right there. So you do yoga. See?
Okay.
All right.
How do you envision the role of integrative therapies in the future in the field of therapies for neurological rehabilitation or stroke recovery in general?
The integration of all therapies would involve very good communication between providers, would be clients keeping track of the therapies that they're doing, making sure that one does not contradict the other, and making sure that the client doesn't rely on the paid professionals to do the integration of their therapy, and that they make it practical and achievable to do on their own. And that professionals like me make sure that we have open lines of communication with other professionals so that we're not doing the same thing, or we're not doing one thing, like I just said, that might contradict what somebody else is doing. So I really believe in, client collaboration, so that people that I'm working with, I know what other disciplines they are receiving as well.
Yeah, I call that you make the choice to be a stroke warrior instead of a stroke survivor.
Hmm.
You become the captain of your own team.
Yeah, like a
That's
leader.
how I reflect on that.
Yeah.
Anyway, looking back on starting all of Stroga and your personal journey, how's these integrative approaches enriched your professional journey?
Oh boy.
Yeah, I know.
Well, I think
I
maybe.
mean, yeah, and the reason I ask is when we first spoke, you gave an example of the lady with the fingernail painting. I
Oh
mean,
my God,
I
good
tell that
memory.
story to everybody.
Oh my God, I
But
love
anyway,
that story. I love that lady. Oh my, just
oh
made me
yeah.
think of her.
But I mean, looking back, how's this all shaping up for
Yeah,
you?
I appreciate that question, because 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I was questioning what I was doing professionally. And maybe I said that in that interview, and this isn't even a joke, I really thought about opening a soft ice cream shop. And I thought that that would still be helping people. I would be providing them with something that they wanted. They would get the ice cream right away, and I would change their day. And here I am these years later, continuing my speech pathology practice and coaching and doing yoga. And I feel like that certainly is my purpose, because I thrive on helping others. And so at this point, I'm glad I'm not serving ice cream, I think, but I'm glad that I could use my knowledge of the brain and communication changes with my passion for making healthy choices and helping other people make healthy choices. And then to top that off, let's make it like a sundae. The cherry on top is that I learned that Stroga, right, this concept that I've come up with, has so many benefits to the person that's had the stroke and people in their lives. So if I could change one person by showing them any of those things, then I feel very fulfilled.
Anything you want to add today that we haven't covered? I think you're
What
pretty
else?
darn good at covering stuff.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the time that I could speak with you about something that I care so much about. And I have to say now, I mean, I think I'm wearing yoga clothes. I think I've got to go do some.
I'm gonna have to go online and look.
That's
I'll,
the other good thing. You could take yoga anywhere you go, because you don't need a gym. You don't need you could do, I've done it on the airplane. I've done it, you could do it anywhere.
oh, wonderful,
Yeah. Yoga
wonderful.
comes with you wherever you go.
How can people find out more about your health coaching and your practice?
They could, that's a good one. They could, so my company, my business is I Communicare, and you can do that on Instagram, or you can go to my website, which is I Communicare, N as in Nancy, C as in Charles.com.
That's wonderful.
All right.
Thank
It's a
you,
pleasure
Abby.
as always, sir.
Yes, ma'am. I thank you very much. You have a great day.
Okay. Namaste.